Brandon was handcuffed in the back of a police car. And because the police jumped to that conclusion, they did not do a thorough investigation. You're going to hear about things that the police should have done in this case that they simply did not do. You're also going to hear that the police only looked for evidence that pointed towards Brandon. The police jumped to conclusions. They did not do a thorough investigation. They only looked for evidence that pointed to Brandon. That's what this case is about. Now, as the judge told you, Brandon sits here in this courtroom, an innocent man. The government has to prove that he did what they're accusing him of. The government has to prove that to you beyond a reasonable doubt. You must consider Brandon to be innocent unless and until the government meets that word. Now, those 4 words, beyond a reasonable doubt, are important. They're the highest standard we have in our legal system. I want to talk to you about some of the reasons you're going to have to doubt the government's case. As I indicated, the police jumped to conclusions. When the first officer arrived, it's a patrol officer, he finds Brandon kneeling, praying in the doorway. Within 5 minutes, Brandon is under arrest. He's handcuffed. He's in the back of a police car. And ladies and gentlemen, Brandon is in the back of that police car long before major crimes arrived, long before the detectives who were actually investigating a homicide arrived. They know that Brandon has been arrested long before they get there. And that fact affects everything that they did going forward. Because the police jumped to conclusions, they did not do a thorough investigation. I want to talk to you about one thing that shows that. There will be others. But I want to start out talking to you about evidence that was collected, but that the police didn't bother to test. You heard that Luis Garcia was shot. The police knew they were investigating a shooting. Now, when a bullet is fired out of a gun, there are 2 parts in a bullet. There's the outer part, the casing, and then there's the bullet itself. And in between the 2, there's some gunpowder. And when the gun fires, that powder explodes, and that's what shoots the bullet out of the barrel of the gun. When that powder explodes, it goes over everything that's really nearby. It gets on the hands of whoever is firing the gun. It gets on the clothing of whoever is firing the gun. Now, you're going to hear that the government got what's called a body warrant. A warrant that allowed them to search Brandon, to search his physical person, to search his body, to search what he was wearing, to search everything that was on him. And you're going to hear the government collected his clothing, but they never tested it. They never tested it for gunshot residue. You're going to hear that they specifically swabbed his hands. And they did that specifically. It's put there, right on an evidence examination request form, that they were swabbing the hands to test for gunshot residue. That testing never happened. Now, this gunshot residue testing, that's not the only thing where police collected evidence but didn't test it. You're going to hear about other things like that as the case proceeds. I'm not going to get into all of them right now. But I am going to ask that you pay careful attention throughout the trial to all the times where the police collected evidence that they should have tested, that they then just didn't bother to even test. And I'm going to ask that you consider that. Keep that in mind and think about that when you're deciding whether the government proved to you that Brandon did what they are accusing him of. There's another way that the government did not do a thorough investigation in this case. I want to talk to you for a moment about some of the evidence that the police didn't even bother collecting. You're going to hear that Brandon had a cell phone. And I don't know how much you all pay attention to how much data a phone truly generates and how much it really keeps track of you. But you're going to hear that there's a tremendous amount of data on a cell phone. One of the things a cell phone can track is your exact location with GPS, down to a couple of feet. It can track the number of steps someone has taken. It can track where they went throughout the day. It can track whether the person received calls or texts, whether there were plans for someone else to come over to the house. All of those kinds of useful bits of information would have been on Brandon's phone. But you're going to hear the police never took his phone. They never asked him for permission to search his phone. They never tried to get a warrant to search his phone. They didn't do anything with his phone whatsoever. Now, that's not the only piece of evidence that they should have collected, should have looked into, but didn't. It's not the only thing that they didn't collect that points to how much they were not thorough in their investigations. So I'm, again, going to ask that you pay attention to the other evidence you hear about the police not collecting, that they would have collected had they investigated properly. The other really important thing in this case to keep in mind as you're listening to all the evidence is that the police were only looking for evidence that pointed towards Brandon. Again, they jumped to that conclusion right off the bat, and they tried to find things that would back that up. You're going to hear the police did not go wherever the evidence would lead them. They specifically looked for evidence that would point to Brandon. And I want to talk to you about one very specific, very important example of that. And that's the gun. You know, the government just told you a few minutes ago that the gun was sent to the state lab and it was fingerprinted. And that's true. And when that happened, what did they find? Surprise, surprise, Brandon's fingerprints were on Brandon's gun. But I want to talk to you about some of the things the government didn't tell you about that gun and did not tell you about what happened at the state lab. Because you're going to hear that prior to that gun being tested for fingerprints, the lab was told to the gun. You're going to hear that prior to testing, 6 swabs, not 1, not 2, 6 different swabs were taken to test for what's called touch DNA. I want to explain that concept just briefly. We all have cells on our skin cells on our hands. When we touch something, we leave tiny, tiny microscopic amounts of our skin behind. And that tiny microscopic amount can be tested, can be collected and tested for DNA. It's called touch DNA. And you're going to hear that when a surface is textured, it's very hard to fingerprint, but it's more likely to leave behind touch DNA. Now, you're going to hear that the state lab collected, as I said, 6 swabs from the gun. Those were from the handle, those were from the trigger. Those 6 swabs would have had DNA from someone who touched the gun by the handle, not leaving fingerprints. Someone who touched the trigger, again, not leaving fingerprints. But the state lab was specifically told, look for evidence that connects the gun to Brandon Castiglione. And if you find it, do not do any more testing. Don't do it. We don't want to know. We don't want to run any tests that might connect the gun to someone other than Brandon. We don't want to do any tests that might connect the gun to the actual killer. No. The lab was told, don't run those tests. The police were only interested in evidence that pointed to Brandon. And ladies and gentlemen, you're going to hear who gave that instruction to the state lab. The person who told the lab to look for evidence to link it to Brandon, and told the lab, don't test those swabs that you took for touch DNA. That person, that was Trooper Stephen Slover, the lead investigator in this case. Now, you've heard that when the police first arrived, and just even minutes before that, when Brandon's sister and his grandmother went into the house and saw him, he was, you're going to hear it probably described a few different ways, but he was down on his knees. Some people have described it as being in a fetal position. And he was praying. You're going to hear that he was speaking in tongues. And you're going to hear that this is not uncommon for Brandon. You will hear that Brandon was, at the time, and is to this day, a deeply religious man. That he went to church regularly at the New England Pentecostal. That one of the things that people do there is speak in tongues. This is something that's part of his religious tradition. You're going to hear from multiple people that they had seen him do this frequently, many times, many different places. They'll tell you that when Brandon is in a state of deep prayer like that, he blocks everything out. He cannot be disturbed. People cannot get his attention. And they'll tell you he can stay in that state for hours at a time. It's not surprising that when Brandon found Luis Garcia dead, that he started praying. Now, I want to talk to you about something else that the government mentioned a few minutes ago. And they said they don't have to prove motive. And that's technically true. They don't. But they're saying that, ladies and gentlemen, because they have absolutely no motive. There was no reason Brandon would have had to kill Luis Garcia. You're going to hear that they were on friendly terms, that they attended the same church, that they frequently went to Bible study together, that they hung out and socialized outside of church activities sometimes. You're not going to hear from a single person who says that they saw Brandon ever argue with Mr. Garcia, with Luis. You're not going to hear from anyone who says that Brandon ever threatened Luis. No, they were friends. When you've heard all the evidence, you will see that the government cannot prove its case. It can't prove its case because the police jumped to conclusions. It can't prove its case because the police did not do a thorough investigation. It can't prove its case because the police only looked for evidence that pointed to Brandon and ignored evidence that didn't. In the end, there is one very, very simple reason the government will not be able to prove its case. Brandon Castiglione did not shoot Luis Garcia. Brandon is not guilty.
Thank you, Counselor.
So the state calls Sergeant Andrew